Keith, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on, mate.
Absolutely a pleasure to be here. Again, I've seen a lot of the people you've had on as guests, some good friends, some people I admire. So appreciative to be part of the group.
No, of course, well, welcome. And, we connected because I read one of your recent LinkedIn posts where you were talking about kind of, what really do teams want, or what really drives change, or what gets things over the line at teams. And we're going to get into that today. But just in case somebody hasn't come across you, do you mind just kind of walking us through your background and bring us through to like the interest, you've got an interesting mix of work right now. Bring us through to kind of where you're at currently.
Yeah. So I've worked and I'll kind of maybe meander in some of the details, but I've worked in elite sport for 26 years now. So started in the NBA, working at the team level, Celtics, Raptors, a decade there. Was at Stanford as the head of performance with men's basketball. And then in 2011, took a role with Nike, which is where I live currently, still up here in Portland, where I was the global director of performance, which was a new role for Nike. And kind of built up that team over 13 years where our main remit was working with Nike's contracted athletes and teams, irrespective of product. I would get brought into product from time to time for sure. But really the role there was help athletes solve problems, right? How do we go beyond a brand like Nike of just providing shirts and shoes, for lack of better description, but actually really help athletes perform at their highest level. And that sort of could be anything from talking to Serena Williams one day and never seeing Serena again to a Korean breakdancer the next day and an NFL player the next day, and really trying to problem solve each one. I left Nike a little over 2 years ago and really kind of went all in on my own consulting firm. So I work now with teams across all sports globally, where I'll work with ownership and management on sometimes hiring their medical and performance departments, building out their processes. And then other roles, again, serve as the head of innovation within New York Liberty, where I work across the organization, coaching, front office, analytics, and really identify areas to go problem solve and innovate against to gain a competitive advantage. Also, my company also will work with founders and investors in the sport tech, health and wellness areas to really just provide value as kind of, someone who's worked in the trenches, but also has the technical acumen in some of those areas. Again, background, sports medicine undergrad, sport performance master's, and then a PhD in applied sports science. So really the simplest way I describe what I do is take that sort of educational and experiential background and connect dots and solve problems, and what that means is different in a little bit in the different areas I work in.
Obviously, you would have in your sort of formative years as a kind of, coach, practitioner kind of person, I'm sure you had you probably eyes on the prize of being staying in the craft like everybody does. Did you kind of have an outside interest in, sports tech, in business, in strategy, or were these kind of things that just organically came together, throughout your career?
I've always been curious. I've always loved to explore different areas and again, like I said, can sort of connect dots from various, different areas and domains. And from a tech side, yeah, I've always been probably, an early adopter, or at least an early, explorer in different things. And, back in, I go back to 2006 where we were doing sleep monitoring and at that time, real-time heart rate monitoring of practices and games, which we weren't supposed to do, but we did anyway, because I really wanted to understand, some of the things we were doing. So yeah, for a long time, I've always been sort of exploring different areas, and it's just always, even whatever the main thing that I was doing at the time, I always had other areas in different projects I would get involved in just to kind of keep my creative energy going.
Yeah, no, really cool. So as I kind of alluded to, one of the things we're going to talk about today, or is a big topic really, is kind of like teams implementing new things, changing systems, changing products, trying new things out, that kind of whole intersection that now obviously you're perfectly placed in, being kind of in business, in tech, in sport, in leadership. So we'll start with a slightly antagonizing one of not to you, but maybe to the audience listening. We'll see. Sport likes to think of itself, this is a statement, sport likes to kind of think of itself very often as kind of cutting edge and being on the front foot of technology and innovation as to how it does things scientifically. But very often teams are not on the absolute front end of that, and they're waiting for somebody else to go first. What in your kind of experience, what do you think separates or divides teams that embrace innovation versus the ones that kind of wait to be the second mover on something?
Yeah, that's a very sort of politically correct way to say that. So, yeah, I might not be as much, but I mean, sport as a whole, one, the sort of, yes, we think we're special in sport is for sure there. And I think you can even take that down one step further. I think each even sport thinks what they do is so different and special. Like, oh, European football is so much different than, baseball. And yes, of course, fundamentally the sport is different. How they go about doing things is really not different, right?
Mm.
One of the things that just drives me crazy is when teams are like, oh, we can't really talk about that. That's our special sauce. Like, bullshit. Right. There's no such thing in my opinion as that, because I think what kind of separates some of those organizations are just their thought process and the people within that organization. So you could take something that this organization is doing at a very, very high level and go put it in this organization, and I promise you it will not work the same. Not right, wrong, or different. It's just not that organization doesn't have the same management, leadership, coaching staff, players, all of these things that make whatever that thing is work. And so I think when you look at the early adopters and maybe some of the ones that aren't as risk averse, because that is really one of the most prevalent things in professional sport, is everybody is so scared. So they're so, risk averse to do something because that's what puts them, somewhat on the chopping block. Right.
Yeah.
Whether that be management, coaching staff, or even, support staff. Right. If they make a decision, it's very easy to just do what everybody else is doing, because then what you're doing is very defensible. Well, that's what Andrew's doing. Right. That's what they're doing. So like, you can't really get mad at me. It's the ones that aren't afraid to kind of step out and try something a little bit differently. And I genuinely think that comes top down. Right. You have people have to feel confident and supported in being able to explore different areas. And not every organization has a mindset like that, right? Like, you can get into the financial, structure of organizations that some are just willing to spend more money than others to explore ideas. Of course, that exists. There's, not every organization is the same in that capacity. But even more so, it's the organizations that kind of almost create an environment where our job is to optimize performance.
I'll put myself on mute and then you were.
No worries.
Sorry, carry on.
I think the organizations that have the mindset of we are here to optimize performance, that's just a different mindset, right? Because if that truly is the mindset, then you are going to explore areas that do that and that put your athletes and your team in a different place to succeed. If your mindset is like, oof, we're just going to let's just go straight down the middle here, and we're not going to, you're obviously not going to embrace change or embrace, not novelty for the sake of novelty, but just, that sort of exploration in entrepreneur, even though I'm not a fan of that word in that space, but that sort of mindset to explore different things. I also think one of the big constraints in a sport organization in that area is those that have a process and those that don't. And I know that through the course of this conversation, that's going to come up several times. But I think the organizations that have a way in which they think about things that is clearly defined throughout the organization and everybody understands, they're just in a better position to go explore and innovate and try new things, where those that don't, they're just not, because one, they don't really know how decisions get made. Right. So they're just always in this kind of, limbo area and unsure of where they can make a decision, where they can push, where they can't. So I think that's really at the end of the day, I think those organizations that are better suited for that, it's a top down approach. And it's just an overall mindset of that organization.
There's this kind of quote that rings in my head while you're speaking of, like, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, which in sport is just not a thing, right? You can't work at a team and take that approach to things. Very often you end up with like a physio or an S&C coach or a sports scientist who's maybe not in a leadership role. They're super deep and into their craft, working with athletes day in, day out. They don't have that kind of front office overlap or managerial aspect of their role. And they want to try new things. They want to bring new products, try new systems, ideas out. Does it ultimately kind of have to fall on the, someone's head's on the block? Does that ultimately have to fall on their management or like, the VP of performance, the director? Does there have to be this kind of like one scapegoat that says, yes, you can do that. And if we screw up or it causes any problems, I'm going to wear it. Like how do teams kind of navigate I want to try something new, but someone may have to be at fault if this goes wrong? It's a horrible question, but
No, it's a very fair question, and it's one that I actually think part of the limiting factor in that is self-preservation, right? And it's one of the reasons why teams are so afraid and practitioners are so afraid to try different things because, to your point, if it goes wrong, then it is sort of the finger is pointed back at them, and I think a lot of people. They work in sport, not necessarily for the wrong reason, like that's sort of a sort of incorrect statement, but they just want to hold on to that job because of the shirt they get to wear around, because of the things that job entails. And that sometimes becomes self-limiting and what you then give yourself the freedom to explore. Because if you're so worried about keeping that job, you're not going to want to stick your head up above, right? Like you're going to want to kind of keep head down and just go with it. And then to your point about leadership, kind of owning that process and owning the decision, I think that's where a lot of people are scared. So they just don't want to do that, kind of to my point. But that's also where the process comes in, because I think if you have a process of not only how you make decisions, but how you actually evaluate that decision process along the way, you never get to the end of it and like, oh my God, that was a disaster. What just happened, right? There's checks and balances along the way if you have the right structure. So you may start to veer off course or it starts to go a way you didn't. So you stop it there, right? That's where, to my earlier point, the organizations that have zero structure in their decision-making process, they kind of have this idea. And they're like, all right, let's try it. And then 6 months later, maybe it's a disaster. It didn't go. It was a waste of money. It was a waste of time, energy, all of these things. And then they're looking for someone to blame because it went so bad, as opposed to those that really have a process. And maybe they see in month one, like, hey, this isn't going to work. Like, let's not waste any more efforts or whatnot. Right. And then that's a little bit easier pill to swallow for ownership, who's footing the bill, management, who's, coaching, whoever it is, that's in part of that process.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think like bringing in products or processes is change, and there's change management there. It's different, but I think it's quite easy for teams to bring in injury experts, a specialist in a particular niche injury, because, okay, they have to have the budget, but they can bring somebody in, say they've had a lot of hamstrings or a lot of calves or a lot of tendons, whatever the injury is. They bring in an expert on whatever the body part is. Assuming they've got the budget, they bring that person in. If that person has a meaningful change to a high prevalence of a certain type of injury, well done staff for bringing in the best person to help with that. Also, though, if they bring that person in and they get more of those injuries, or they get a worse injury and they brought that person in, they can also kind of quite safely go, this is in my opinion, they can go, well, we brought in the best there is and this still happened. Problem's not with us, or this was inevitable because we brought in the best person and it still happens. It's kind of like not scapegoat, but it's a very easy way to go, wasn't us, we brought in the best, we did everything we could here.
Absolutely.
It's a very low risk implementation of something versus doing something different. So, yeah.
And that's where, like I said, like that's sort of like, if you just shoot down the middle and kind of do what everybody else is doing, it's an easy defense, right? When you start to kind of stray from the norm, even with structure, even with a thought process, like there's always risk involved with that. And that's why, I think so few people do it, because they're so risk averse, especially in sport.
I've kind of seen you write about like, implementing things and like the true cost of bringing in something new, be that process or system. The cost is not just the price of bringing it in. When a team is looking for a new product, system, process, whatever it is, holistically, what is that cost? What does it entail? Like, what are the sort of, how is it going to cost them in different ways other than just monetarily?
I think, one of the things too is, when you say yes to something, you have to either say no to something else, or put something else aside, or you're just kind of continue to pile on. Certainly if we're talking about a support staff, whether that be, medical, performance, sports science, like, but it's all performance in my mind. So, um, they do a lot of things across an organization, right? So if we're just going to continue to add on to it, that's going to have a huge impact across the board, not just of that technology, but like, is it adding more stress to their lives? Is it adding in all of these things that kind of maybe are underneath the surface, but they play a role in what comes to the surface. And I think when teams have a really structured thought process in how they evaluate different products they're going to bring in. So, okay, what again, we could probably start at the beginning, like, what problem are we trying to solve? Like, just even that question alone, I don't know if enough organizations do. They just, someone hits them up about this technology, a rep on this tech, and it sounds great, but is it really a problem that they're having? Right? Do they need to bring it in? And I think some people too are also afraid to say no. Um, because they don't look at those impacts that you're kind of talking about, outside of just whether it's the financial part of it, of, again, who's going to own that. If we're going to adopt something new, is who's going to drive the implementation of that. And certainly if it's going to extend beyond any maybe one person or even small group of people in that organization, how is it going to impact the front office? How is it going to impact the coaching staff, the athletes? All of those have to be taken into account and looked at it from those stakeholders' points of view, before you go ahead and implement it. And I think a lot of times, that level of detailed work isn't done. And a lot of the times I feel, because it's boring, right? To sit around a table and kind of get clear on language, get clear on, like, how we're doing these things. Like, it's not sexy. It's tedious at times, but I think kind of as you come out of that process, you can then get very, very clear on how you make decisions and how you kind of go about implementing new, whether it's new technology or whatever it is, new decisions. But again, that's that front end work. I don't think a lot of people do, and to understand the implementation, or the impact of some of those decisions across the organization.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like we're more driven by not being behind than we are being ahead, as a sort of like backroom staff,
Yep.
scientific kind of community that work with athletes. And I think, like, to me at least, like, I've been in environments where people have tried to sell me things, and I've been in environments where I've tried to implement things. And I'm sure most people have been on both sides of those fences at different times.
Mhm.
Why do sort of practitioners, time, attention, internal bandwidth, why do those things feel like they really outweigh maybe the upside of doing something different, or deciding to adopt something new? Now, obviously, if somebody brings in a product or suggests a change that is going to add on an hour to your day as a practitioner, you're not going to do it. But there's this sort of like, oh, well, the
Right.
status quo, this is how we do it now. But we also want to innovate and do new things. But if we do those new things, it's going to change how we do things already. We've got our systems. So how do sort of teams like navigate, is the juice worth the squeeze here or not?
Yeah, I think it also, you kind of have to look at, like, how some of the practitioners in those organizations, how they're evaluated by you know by their management group, right? Because I think, to your point, you bring in an injury expert, and it's like very easy to be like, oh, we tried, right? If you try something new, like, how do you, one, not defend against it, but like, how do you articulate the thought process behind it, and then not necessarily how are you rewarded, but like, what does that look like in the eyes of management in terms of how they evaluate decision making, but also that ability to explore and innovate, right? I think and that's where I think a lot of front offices across all sport, they don't have a good really process to judge what good is. So I think it's just this default of practitioners working in the space to be like, oh, we're just going to do what we always do, because I know at least my GM, or whoever it is, maybe they get that and they understand. Ooh, we kept Andy healthy, right? Like, like, we played this many games, and that's cool. That that's part of the role in sport if you're working in that space. but that shouldn't be the only thing that you're evaluated on as a staff and as a practitioner. And I think,
Yeah,
as staff's kind of, what, or go ahead.
so I was gonna say, like, sometimes, do you ever feel like it's easier for we've got this trend of like practitioners that work one-to-one with athletes. So then they're not on the payroll, they're not in the staff, they're in the facility regularly because they work with an athlete. Do you think sometimes it's easier for them to be more experimental and try new things out because they haven't got that infrastructure of staff above them? It's just, if the player's happy, they're safe, they're doing their job well. Do you think it's kind of easier for them almost to sort of like try new things out and experiment?
Absolutely. And I've seen the good aspect of that and the bad aspect of that. And to be fair, I have been that, right? I've worked in the team environment, and then I have been, with my role not only at Nike, where I wasn't part of the team, but I was working very much, hand in hand with an athlete and overseeing things. But I also approached it understanding what that team personnel has to deal with. Like they have a coach they have to answer to. They have a GM they have to answer to. So how can I help them answer the questions I know they're going to be asked? Because it's not fair to them if I'm overseeing, again, and I'm not necessarily make it up because this is legitimate, but if I'm overseeing an athlete's, performance and the team staff isn't really, involved in it, although I would try and collaborate and try and be as, transparent as possible, like they're the ones judged on it. If something goes wrong with an athlete, right? So, which isn't always fair. And it's certainly, sometimes I think it's actually, it's really, it's a shame because they don't have control over what that private practitioner is doing, but yet they're the ones that are going to take the heat from that management in front office if that athlete isn't performing the way they need to, right? Which is a really interesting area. But that being said, to your point, I do think those independent practitioners, of course, they have more freedom.
Yeah.
To explore different ideas. I know I did, and we would do things. I don't think that we're that far outside of, we weren't doing anything crazy because I had a valid rationale for everything we were doing and why we were doing it. I also had the luxury though of working with one athlete, in like that setting of being able to think a little bit differently than when you're in an NFL team and you got to deal with 60 athletes on a day-to-day basis, and you have to put out fires for tomorrow's practice. And like, I didn't have to deal with those things. So that naturally just gives you a little bit more freedom to explore and think a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's a bit of like an opposing continuum with like the higher up or the higher level of sport you go into, the greater level of resources you get and the sort of better equipment and things you have access to work with your athletes. But equally, you probably have more complex politics and more red tape to get things over the line. I think like, if I look on my career, I think like the time where I probably had the healthiest balance of access to good resources and like being able to do the job how I want to do it, if you like, but then also having the freedom to do things, I think was probably collegiate sport, where you can work in a collegiate environment and the budget's pretty good. It's not as good as maybe a pro team, or sometimes it is. But for the most part, like you've probably got like a full Vault suite. You've probably got a very good weights room, good training room, good toys to play with. And you've probably got a little bit more freedom with the athletes and other staff members to do it. And I think for me, collegiate's always been the sweet spot for that. Now, obviously, there'll be some pro teams where people have more carte blanche than others to do what they want. But I find it interesting sort of seeing like conversations I have with friends that work in pro sport. They've got everything they need, but they can't always use it. Or they can't always.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it's why it's funny. Like I'll talk to some, founders of companies and in sport tech, and they're like, oh, like we want to go talk to that team because they're like the biggest team, right? Like name and everything. And that's cool from a branding perspective. But that also comes with a lot of issues and politics, to your point, and all these things. And while, yes, from the outside, it looks like that is the shiny team in sport, it's really tough to navigate a team like that because there are so many different people who want a voice in those organizations, who want to kind of control things, who, red tape you have to deal with, bureaucracy, all those things. And I agree. I think sometimes the smaller, maybe, under the radar teams, again, as long as they have kind of good leadership in there, it's a little bit easier to be nimble.
Yeah. One of the things I was kind of curious to hear your opinion on was, and I'm going to land this plane. This is a long-winded question, so forgive me, but I read Checklist Manifesto years ago. I'm not sure if you've read it.
Yeah.
And for the listeners, if they haven't read it, it's very much about how these very simple checklists have incredible outcomes in high-stakes environments. As simple as they are, they make a big difference to surgical success, airline safety, all these different things, how fast a building can be built. Sport's quite a high-stakes environment. You know, if you get something wrong, it has a very big impact on a player, on their life, their health, on a team, even on like maybe like a city's economic status, you know, people pouring into bars when a team's doing well. Very high stakes. I will land this plane. Sometimes the best solutions are the simplest, but they're the easiest ones to overlook because they seem like common sense. How do you, you know, maybe if you're at a team or you're trying to get something over the line at a team, let's say, how do you get people to lean into the simple intervention that might actually have the best ROI for performance rather than maybe a more complex, shiny thing that maybe makes a more marginal difference?
It's tough. I mean, I'm not going to kind of sugarcoat it because, especially in today's day and age, right? Like, your athletes, your coaches, your owners, right? They consume all the same information, kind of we do as practitioners, right? And but they don't always have the filter that professionals who have maybe the educational and experiential background have. So they see a sensational article on ESPN or wherever, and like, oh my God, this team is doing, they're flying their players to to outer orbit just to get some enhanced recovery, and they come. It's like, hey, why aren't we going to outer space? It's like, well, because like, can we just get our players to drink more water? Because that probably have a bigger impact. That's not as sexy. That's not as right. And I think sometimes practitioners become a victim of that, right? So, um, you know, a team makes a hire and they bring in, a vice president of performance, and they're going to oversee this whole department of this, professional sport team that is outlaying, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for their players each year. And they're like, hey guys, so we're just going to do this like super simple thing. It's almost like, they feel like to justify their job, they can't just have a simple solution. They have to come in with this all singing, all dancing, super intricate and complicated solution and approach to justify their job, right? As opposed to being one, confident in their own abilities and do it in a structured manner where actually the simple thing is going to have the biggest effect. And then conversely, like, does the owner or GM who just hired this person, if I come and present like, what, we're really going to focus on our athletes drinking, 24 ounces of water. Again, obviously I'm making it up, right? They're going to look, most of them were probably looking like, wait a second, I thought you were going to come in here and you were going to give us the most, cutting edge technology that's going to do this. And like, you just want us to drink more water. Yeah, it's probably going to have a bigger effect than doing some of that things in the longer term, right? So you're kind of playing this game sometimes, unfortunately, in sport where you're almost trying to justify things, and to do that, you have to almost show like you're exploring these different areas and ideas, and again, and then you're also always playing the well, look what they're doing. Right. Look what the New York Yankees are doing. Right. If you're or the Los Angeles Dodgers, like, look what they're doing. Yeah, they might be doing some things because they have some really interesting resources, but you don't always know like behind the scenes what's happening in that organization. And so I think sometimes a lot of things are taken out of context too. And to what I was saying earlier, you can't just take what that team is doing and plug it into this team. It's not going to work that way. So I think that sort of prevailing thought process, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. I wish more teams took that sort of checklist manifesto approach of just doing like, let's nail down the basics. Actually, one of the things there that you mentioned coming straight out of that book is if you look at the airline industry and their after action reviews, right? When something goes wrong, how detailed they are. You could take the same thing from a military. Like, that is a very impactful concept. And I don't know why, again, I've worked in corporate America. I don't know why it wasn't done more there, and in sport for sure. but it's like people just want like, oh, that's boring. Like we're going to like talk through the decision we made. But yes, but that's going to have a massive impact on how we make decisions moving forward and what we can learn from things, both good and bad. But it's like those things, those basic things, as I said earlier, they're not sexy. So I think people often overlook them or they undervalue the importance and impact of them.
Yeah, I've seen it myself. Like I remember in my younger coaching years, my mentor, I used to run these like sort of plyometric sessions. We used to have like too many athletes, not enough staff and resources. So we actually had like a plyometric session where we'd get like court-based athletes from different sports to be in a session working on plyo-based stuff and technique. Not perfect, but it's just kind of what we were working with. And I remember my mentor at the end of a session, he'd quite often watch me coach. And then he would ask me, what went well, what didn't go as well, what are you going to do different next time? Beginning of the next session, what did you say you were going to do different today that you're now going to do differently today? And we just went through that process every week for like a 12-week process. From a practitioner standpoint, I've never gone through such good development at how I coach or how I do something, because it was just every repetition was very thoughtful and deliberate and reflective on the last and iterative in that way. But so yeah, 100%. And it's super, super simple, like the easiest, simplest thing to implement if you can just stick to it. But I love what you said about the hydration.
There's a lot of things, consistency.
Yeah, and I love your example about water was perfect. Like I remember when I used to work in consulting, I'd sort of bounce around to different NBA teams, a sport and league well, I know. I can imagine a world where you need players to drink more water and you could come up with, we need a water bottle that gives them alerts, or we need to hydration test them at this frequency or something. And, from what I've seen, like if you just put fridges everywhere with a variety of different fluids in them, players will find water. And it's that kind of like habit stacking, isn't it? It's super simple. Doesn't need to be overly technical or complicated or culturally shifting. It's just, okay, we can just intervene by implementing these fridges in different places and see players.
Yeah, just water. Just behavior modification. And how do you kind of create the environment to elicit the behaviors you're trying to instill? It's funny. I was at Google's like headquarters. This is a number of years ago, and walking around, and it didn't even, I didn't notice until the person who was giving me kind of a tour and taking me to all different places pointed it out. But to that sort of behavior modification, trying to sort of make their employees make healthier choices, and their refrigerators in their common areas and in their cafeterias and all these different things were really interesting. And as soon as he pointed out, I'm like, that's genius. They would have all of the water and like very healthy options at the top. And then as the glass case went down, the less healthy options were at the bottom, but the glass was frosted. So like as you went down, you almost couldn't see them as options. So you look at the fridge and all you see are water, healthier options. So you open the fridge, you grab that, right? You don't notice that there's, Coca-Cola and all the other things at the bottom that, they were like, look, we have to have them for employees, but we're trying, how do we subtly shift the mindset to make the choices that we're trying to do? Now, that's a novel approach, right? That's a pretty basic thing. If you were to go in and be like, hey, here's what we're going to do in our thing, like you might have some management that they're like, oh, that's actually a really interesting way to think about it. You might have others that were like, they want the water bottle that gives alerts and they want all these other things as opposed to doing something as basic as like, no, we're just going to frost the glass. That's all we're going to do. But I guarantee that would have a much bigger impact on an athlete's behavior and choice selection than a water bottle that, will alert every time they need to take a sip.
Yeah. I'm curious because, you've been in different roles, different types of environment within sport and others. As a physio, if I've got to go to a coach as an example, and most physios will relate to this, you screw up the first few times how you tell a coach when a player is going to be back. And then you almost develop a bit of a way that you do it, like a way that you approach that conversation, where the outcome is you want to get the information over to the coach, survive it yourself, and everyone be on the same page, let's say.
Yeah.
Different context. You're at a team, you want to get a new process system, or you want to implement some change essentially. Do you have a sort of strategy or kind of cheat sheet in your mind as to like how you approach those conversations? Let's say you're going to head of department or the front office for permission, whichever role it is. Do you have a sort of way that you try to navigate those conversations?
I've learned over time, I wasn't always this way, but to just be very, very open in that conversation, right? And try and again put myself in their position. So I always trying to kind of think through strategies to that point is, whether it's a coach, whether it's a front office, like let me understand the problems they have to deal with and how they think and operate and what is going to help them do their jobs better. Because at the end of the day, like that's all anyone wants. Like, is Andy helping me do my job better? Cool. Then I can buy into maybe I can be on board with maybe some of the things he's trying to do. If you're just trying to sort of, force your opinion or your thought process on me without taking mine into account, well, it's probably going to have that more adversarial feel than true partner and connected. So one of the things that I always do is I just try and understand the different, perspectives that each of those groups and stakeholders within an organization are showing up with. Because again, if you just sort of on the surface level think about that, right? Your front office, like they're thinking about things in the future. They're trying to, yes, of course they want to win today, but they're thinking about things like, okay, like if we make this trade, like what does that do in 2 years? If we do this, like where are we positioning ourselves? Coaches, they're not thinking about 2 years and 3 years from now. They're not even thinking about 2 and 3 weeks from now. They're thinking about tomorrow's practice, tomorrow's game, maybe a couple games from now. So, okay, so I have to meet them where they're at. And then an athlete, like they just want to play. Like they care about like, okay, help me now go perform my best. And then same thing, even performance staff is like, what's going to allow this staff to be most effective, right? So that's the one thing I would say, again, early in my career, I would try and impart like my knowledge and expertise and on them and also get frustrated why they didn't understand it. That's not their background. That's not their, like, they don't even think about it the way I'm thinking about it. So why would I expect them to understand the point of view I was having? So, again, I unfortunately learned it a little bit, probably later than I should have. But that's definitely the one thing that I think, as you're having those conversations, trying to implement new processes, you have to understand the perspectives of the stakeholders within an organization. Otherwise, you're just trying to sort of jam that square peg in a round hole, or you're hoping for, alignment at times. And again, to what you started that question with, I've seen that time and time again of going and talking to a coach about a player. Cause again, like I said, they're thinking about tomorrow. Is this player available for me tomorrow? Because especially if they're a good player, my job depends on having that player help us win games. If they're not available, our chance to win goes down. Therefore, my livelihood is at stake. That is a very different thought process, right? That I think most physios they're not showing up to that conversation thinking like, oh yeah, I guess this is how this coach thinks about things. Like if they've just lost 3 games in a row because they haven't had their best player. And if they go maybe 4 or 5 more games, they might get fired. And maybe if they had that perspective, it might change kind of how they approach that. But I remember I was with one department head. It was their very first time working in a team environment. They had been an individual, kind of practitioner up until that point. And, I was sitting in the office, and one of the assistant coaches, the number one assistant coach, asked this person about one of the star players who had missed the last several practices. Hey, when is such and such going to be back? Oh, she'll probably be back like Thursday. Okay, they hadn't gotten imagery yet. They hadn't got a sort of a diagnosis from the doc. They haven't, they hadn't really thought through anything or implement. But that's what he said. And coach, great. Turned around, walked away. And I just looked at him and I said, that was a problem. Why is that? He didn't understand. I'm like, well, because now that coach expects that athlete to be in practice on Thursday. He's like, oh, but that's not what I said. I said, probably Thursday. I'm like, that's not how coaches think. They heard Thursday, they think Thursday. So now what if we get the imagery back and they're going to be out another 2 weeks? Like now, you've kind of set yourself up for failure, unfortunately, in that coach's mind, because all they heard was Thursday. And so I think, kind of being not necessarily hedge your bets, right? But what should that person should have said? We're waiting on the results, right? I think also in that scenario, any practitioner, right? They want to have the answers. They want to be seen as valuable, and as if they're solving problems. But I don't know. Let me get back to you, or like those are acceptable answers, right? I think some coaches maybe are more accepting than those responses than others, but like you'd almost rather say that than say something that's going to kind of backfire on you, or that you just don't know yet, right? And I think that's where practitioners get into problems.
Yeah, it's kind of like, can I give you a more accurate answer in 48 hours? Or do you need me to give you an answer now? So
Yep.
you're kind of implying like, I can give you a crap answer now that might change, or if you give me 48 hours. And if they say like, well, why 48 hours? You can say, okay, we're waiting for imaging to come back, or we need to give it this much time until we do imaging, and then we can get the answer. I think it's sort of almost trying to lure them into like them making the choice of the answer you give them. If you can finesse it that way.
Yep. That's a very good
Easy,
way to say it, for sure.
easier said than done when you've got a coach just point blank asking you when are they going to be back, or when are you going to
Again,
tell me
very easy for you
yeah.
and I to just talk about things here in the comfort of our respective rooms,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, people will be going, what the hell does Andy know? He's working from home right now. So yeah. One of the things I'm curious is like, you've got your ear to the ground in sport, in tech, with teams, all these different kind of like things that intersect investment. Do you see any trends going on at the moment? And the reason I ask that is I'm always just curious about this, where I look at when I started in my career and everyone was doing movement screens and FMS and preseason testing looked like the quality of how you move, because we didn't have the tech to measure the force around movement, the kinetics. Then we went all into kinetics. I don't know how you see it, but for me, I feel like we might be going back into like a methods phase where we're thinking about how we actually do exercises, what techniques. And that's just my like view of the industry. Do you see any trends that have changed over time, or things that you think we're heading towards now? Because I think fads come and go, and where we focus our attention comes and goes as practitioners as well.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, and certainly in the 26 years I've been fortunate enough to work in sport, I've definitely seen a lot of trends and sort of pendulum swing and then revert back. I would agree with you. I think it is maybe, I don't want to say less is more at the moment, and again, which is a really difficult thing to say in 2026 because there's no shortage of more, right?
Yeah.
Every day something new, something coming out. But I think being able to take a step back and try and understand how everything fits together. I think, your teams that are kind of moving forward a little bit, maybe faster, are doing a better job, even though that sounds maybe, kind of at odds with each other, like they're slowing down to then speed up. But I do see that. One of the things I think, look, maybe that's just is also because it's something that's top of mind for me in an area I'm focused at. Is one in facilities in general, right? Like, how do you create a facility that enhances the work that everybody is doing across the organization? But and then maybe with that, an area that I am very much focused on, certainly over the last couple of years too, is like, how do you accelerate learning across an organization? And you could probably say that in a few different areas. One, at the athlete level, like, how do you accelerate an athlete's ability to learn, whether that's what a coach is trying to teach or what they're trying to then go translate onto the game, onto the court or field in a game, right, from practice. I think it's a really interesting space at the moment. I think if you look back at how maybe some sports have taught things over the years, and I'm not just talking about like, oh, let's all do CLA work and like that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is like, okay, we sit and we watch film, and that's really he hasn't changed much in the last number of years, but I think it should, right? Like, what can we pull from the educational ed tech sector of what they're trying to do in schools and enhance, student learning and how do you get teachers to be better deliverers of information? Well, that's a coach. So how do we enhance the ability of our coaches to teach? How do we enhance, those things? That's something that I think is you're going to see a little bit more and more in sport. I feel, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it's just going to be the teams that I work with, because that's an area I'm focused on. But I think, that coupled with these facilities, I think you're starting to see like more thoughtful design of facilities, of
Yeah.
how they can do that, right? How you can enhance not just the learning across an organization, but just the ability of the various stakeholders in that organization to be successful, right? That's athletes, that's staff, that's coaches, that's front office. So that's one thing I definitely I've at least been exposed to across a bunch of the organizations that I work with.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? I think there's if you go into different facilities, different leagues, different teams, there's always different low-hanging fruit that seems apparent in different leagues. Like, I won't pick on any leagues, but certain leagues where you might have individual players who don't like to lift. They need to lift. They need to be working on their long-term physical development a lot more. But you get certain sports, I'm being careful not to name them.
What team are you, what sport are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Who's the individual? But you get these athletes who are good regardless of being, quote unquote, not a great physical athlete, if we talk about them as a gym athlete. Which is interesting, right? Because you might be that team or a practitioner might be trying to implement a new system, product, or something quite in the weeds. But the low-hanging fruit might be, hey, like a certain percentage of your players don't lift enough, or they're not lifting often enough. They're not doing enough physical prep work to become more robust, maybe even perform better. So I think it's interesting, because I think there is some, I think if you can kind of constrain the environment or the schedule or the systems and find ways to do these, low-hanging fruit, simple things like getting athletes to train sounds simple, but actually it can be quite hard in practice.
Yeah.
Depending on the culture, the environment, they walk in the building here, they can go straight to the changing room. They can avoid even walking past the training room, the gym, and the staff that might go, hey, come in here, let's do a few
absolutely.
minutes. So, yeah.
Yep. No, I couldn't agree more with that. And that's, again, one thing sort of in that thoughtful design of spaces of, how do you make it, again, back to the behavior, behavior modification in creating that, the environments to elicit, what you're trying to accomplish as an organization, for sure. Yeah. And again, I think some of that too. Oops, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, go on, Carol.
I was going to say some of that also comes down to a staff's ability, and I'm talking about support staff, now performance medical, to educate the various stakeholders in that organization, right? And that's something that I've always held true when I was in the team environment and as a private practitioner, like whatever it is, right? Like my role was to educate it. Again, although I said it earlier, like I did a bad job of doing that with coaches and management early in my career. I always held that to be one of the highest sort of goals that I had with my athletes that I worked with, because I always was of the mindset of, if I can make them better consumers of information about themselves, like not to say they'll always make better choices, but they're going to be exactly that, better consumers of information, right? They'll be able to call bullshit a little bit easier. They'll be able to, like, look, they're still going to make the right choices, but my job is to educate them, not just tell them what to do, but to explain to them why we're trying to do it, and teach them all of these different areas. And that's one thing that I see organizations who they complain about compliance. They complain about, to your point, it is difficult to get athletes, especially in certain sports, and even some athletes in other sports where maybe training is a little bit more culturally relevant, but that athlete doesn't like to. Well, how do I get them to understand like the impact it has, right? How do I get them to kind of understand and connect those dots? Like that's the role. And I think the teams who sometimes have bad compliance, it's because they have bad communication. They have bad education, sort of implementation from staff to athlete to get those athletes to make better choices. Because, I can count probably on one hand the amount of athletes I've ever worked with that were just like difficult in that way. Right? Like, not to say everybody's perfect for sure, but I think, if you take the time to really sort of maybe explain things, that athletes inevitably will make kind of the choices that you'd like them to make in the long run.
Yeah. I'd love to know your process for sort of like, team contacts you and they say, we want you to help redesign our facility, as an example. Well, it's not just a shopping list that, well, you should have this machine and this machine. That's the easy bit. That's the fun bit. The reason I ask this is like, with my software company game plan, I'm very often thinking about, okay, what does a physio have to do as their job? What's their kind of day-to-day workflow of how they do things, and how do I design a system that improves that? When you're designing a facility, is it similar where you're kind of thinking like, okay, what's the physical, tangible workflow of operations, or do you find yourself like interviewing essentially like the staff a lot, of thinking like what's going well, what are the problems, to kind of work out what are these workflows that you need to improve? Is it similar?
Yeah. Yeah, very similar, right? And then even, kind of, although I'm sure this is similar too, but even one step further of like, what is this organization ready for? Right? Like what can
Yeah.
they handle? Because, it's easy. Let's say resources, there's no, constraints on that. Well, yeah, you could come in and be like, we're going to hire 15 physios and we're going to hire a strength coach for every single athlete and we're going to do that. That would fail miserably if that
Yeah.
organization was not set up to handle that, right? And I mean, like, are the athletes ready for that? Is it going to be overwhelming for them? Is it going to, their coach, like, all of these things have to be thought through. And then, you could maybe get there, right? But like, let's build a plan to get there. And when you're talking about facilities, for sure, like what works, what doesn't, the tough part with a facility at times is you have competing interests, but not necessarily
Yeah.
competing, but you have like, oh, well, we need to do this. And yeah, I know, but there's trade-offs like anything. Back to one of your earlier questions about adopting a new technology. Well, there's going to be a trade-off for something else, right? Like you can't just adopt something new without maybe something either losing a little bit of focus and energy towards it. And so like, what is that trade-off? And I think as you design a facility, it's a similar, again, which goes back to also the shiny toy question. We're talking through like a film room. Well, it's one thing for like, oh, we want this absolute plush film room and our athletes are in just these oversized chairs and they're okay. Is that most conducive to learning? Is that like a really good learning environment? It might look $1 million and it might have all these cool features, but is it going to enhance our players' ability to learn or whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish in that space? And I think that's where you have to like really get clear as an organization. And again, part of that is actually interviewing. I think again, from ownership down, what are we trying to do? Right. And then again, then make decisions based on that. And then build out sort of a long-term plan to maybe get to because you might not be able to get to, hey, this is what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, cool. You might not be able to get there in year one.
Mm.
Because if you do, not to say you can't, you could, but it might not work. So let's look at that as our kind of North Star, but we're going to get there in year 3 and we're going to actually back out of that and create the incremental steps to get there so that when we do arrive there, like the organization can actually fully embrace and accept and implement what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I guess you can kind of only move at the speed of like the acceptance of change, right? Like in an organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure there's a bit of a managing up and down way. If you're in a leadership position in a performance department, you've probably got young, hungry practitioners asking, "Can we have this? Can we do this?" And you want to say yes, but equally, you might have to go and get permission from someone above you to implement certain things. And there's only a certain number of bullets you can fire in a set period of time. So you almost have to. I think I spoke to Joe Clubb about this earlier in the year around like there's almost like a periodization of change of like, I've got all these things we want to do. I got to prioritize which ones I do and when. And we might have to wait, like you said, like 2 years, 3 years until we can actually do certain things. Or it might just be, we want to do all these things. This is what we want our delivery and service to look like to the athletes and the team. But we actually can't do these things until we get these basic things in place first. What's the point of doing all this testing if we can't get athletes to train, as an example?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's sometimes where people get nervous to, oh, I know, but that doesn't sound good. Like I need to deliver that, even though it's going to come at like their own detriment or maybe personally, professionally, but also organizationally. Because again, if you're not set up for success, and that's the thing, like I think you have to be okay to like, great idea. We're not ready for that right now. and then also be able to say why you're not ready for it, because that also may help, those above you. Oh shoot, well, if we're not ready for that, like, what do we need to do? Well, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z. Cool. And now maybe you can start to kind of push things forward. But I think that's where people get into trouble, is they try and do things that they're not ready for, and then let's say it fails. The idea was sound. The premise of what they were trying to do, spot on. You just weren't ready for it, so it failed. And that's where I think a lot of my frustration, you know, uh, currently, sure, but certainly, over the last number of years, is like, when you hear organizations and leaders are, we tried that sports science stuff. That stuff doesn't work. Really? Really? Is that like, tell me more. Oh yeah, we tried to do this and it didn't really, like, and as you dig a little bit more, that did exactly what it says it was going to do. Again, if that technology did, you just didn't have the infrastructure to fully capture the value of what that was trying to provide. So you just think it failed. You think sports science is no good, right? If you're a GM, and that inevitably, I think sometimes, and it has in certain environments, like, has a negative effect on the field itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that. I think like an example is you could take something like GPS and looks at lots of different things, but let's just say it looks at distance and speed. Two simple things. I've been in an environment where they were using it to make athletes compete on how fast they could run in a single session. Yeah. But they didn't have the S&C structure in place to actually make them robust enough to do that. So they basically made athletes competitive at how fast they could run without the robustness, and then had lots of non-contact muscle injuries happening. Versus you might have a different team, same technology, looking at similar information, speed and distance, and using that to go, okay, there's a sweet spot here. This is enough, this is too much. This is going to stimulate adaptation and be healthy. This is going to exceed that. So, it's like, it's the same tech, it's the same solution, but one's using it in one way, one's using it in the other. It's not fair to say whether the tech works. It's how you're using that tech and the question Absolutely. And the problems it solves. So yeah, 100% agree. And I'm sure over your career, you've probably seen a few funny examples, not just GPS, but other ones like that where go great or bad.
Anyone who's worked in sport long enough has certainly seen some of those examples for sure.
Yeah. Well, mate, I love these high level conversations, and it's just really interesting to kind of hear your perspective on it, having, knowing that you wear different hats and you've kind of, approached it from internal in sport, external in businesses, and everything in between. So where can people kind of follow you, find you? What's like the best place for people to track you? Your work
LinkedIn
activity.
is probably...
Track you sounds a bit stalkerish. Where can people follow your professional activities?
Yeah, probably LinkedIn is the best. I'm getting better at being more, engaged in that platform. So it'd probably be LinkedIn is the best one. But again, I'm always out and about trying to travel around. Love connecting with people while I'm traveling in different cities. So, but LinkedIn is probably the best way to track me down, so to speak.
Cool. Well, mate, thank you for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.